In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Grant, Almighty God, that we may celebrate with heartfelt devotion these days of joy, which we keep in honor of the risen Christ, and that we relive in sacred remembrance we may always hold to in what we do. We ask this through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, God forever and ever. Amen. Amen. Anybody have any questions or concerns from last Tuesday night about the readings we went over? No? Everyone's good? Okay. We've been talking off and on about the Gospel of John, and the first reading tonight is from John's Gospel, from the appendix, actually, of John's Gospel, the 21st chapter. And then the reading after that is from Mark, also his last part of his Gospel for the Saturday of Easter week. Now, we often talk about John as being the most theologically sophisticated of the four Gospels. But long before John wrote his Gospel, there were other people who were espousing Jesus' divinity in ways that are similar to John's. One of those folks, as you might imagine, was St. Paul the Apostle. Now, it can be argued that St. Paul is probably the most well-educated of all the apostles. He was a Pharisee, born of Pharisees. He learned how to be a Pharisee in Jerusalem, which was not his native town. So he was able to be a Roman citizen, which was very unusual for a Jewish person to be a citizen of the Roman Empire. None of the other apostles had that dignity, shall we say. So I thought I'd share with you a bit of St. Paul's theology of Christ. This can be found in St. Paul's letter to the people of Colossae. We usually call it the letter to the Colossians. It's the first chapter, verses 11 to 20. With joy, let us give thanks to the Father, who has made you fit to share the inheritance of the holy ones in light. He delivered us from the power of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of our sins. Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him were created all things in heaven and on earth, both the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him. Jesus is before all things, and in him all things hold together in existence. He is head of the body of the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that in all things he himself might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of divinity was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile all things for him, making peace by the blood of his cross. Through him, whether those on earth or those in heaven. So if you imagine St. Paul writing this letter to the Colossians, who lived probably in a pagan territory in Greece. They might have had a small Jewish colony in the city that Paul attached himself to at first, and then used it as a base to preach to the rest of the citizens, the Gentiles. He probably wrote this and other of his letters between 49 and 60, give or take, AD. Long before any of the evangelists wrote their Gospels, and very long before St. John sat down and wrote his Gospel. So even here with St. Paul, the idea of Christ living before the Incarnation in the bosom of the Father as the second person of the Trinity is quite astounding. The theology is developing of the Trinity, who they are, what they are, who they are not, and what they are not as well. Living as the fullness of divinity, that second person of the Trinity, and then becoming human in the mystery of the Incarnation, that boggles the human mind. We have a hard time being foibled, feeble, mortal humans. We can't even imagine what it is to be perfectly human, let alone perfectly divine, let alone the combination of the two which we see in Christ. But yet Paul has it, and John has it, and there are bits and pieces, inklings of it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So we have this very strong theology of the divinity of Christ, but it's not divorced from the fact that the flesh is the hinge point of it all. It's through the flesh that Jesus suffers. It's through the flesh that he is raised from the dead. The material nature of the human body is not an evil thing. It's created by God, and God said it was good. And he proves that beyond the shadow of a doubt by having his own Son take on that very same flesh. And that should give us a great deal of consolation. And remember, in his human life, as the itinerant preacher from Nazareth, he did not cure all illnesses for everybody at the time. A leper here, a leper there, a blind person here, a blind person there. He did not cure all the lepers. He didn't cure all the blind people. He didn't raise all those who had died, just a handful here or there. Had he done so, what would have happened? We don't know. But he still has us to do his work. We are called, just as he was called, like he gave the apostles the same charge, to raise the dead, heal the sick, bind up the wounded. We are now that physicality of Christ in the flesh. That's what it means to be a baptized Christian. Does that make sense? Does that resonate with folks? Okay. All right. Our resurrection narratives for this evening. Before we get into the one from St. John and then St. Mark, there's a little bit about clothing in the Gospel of John about Peter in the boat. That's a post-resurrection revelation of the risen Christ. Back a few days earlier in the garden, but only in Mark's Gospel, during the arrest scene, there's another dressing scene. In this case, it's an undressing scene. So keeping the idea of dressing, undressing, what it means to be clothed, what it means to be unclothed. Is there shame involved? Is there flight involved? What exactly? Because in Scripture, nothing is left to chance. There's a reason for everything in the text. So this is a little prelude to the Gospel from John. It's Mark chapter 14, two little verses, 51 and 52, the last two verses of that chapter. A certain young man was following him, namely Jesus, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. So keep that image in mind when we get to Peter and the boat scene, which we have right now. This is the Gospel for the Friday of Easter week, John chapter 21, verses 1 to 14. Jesus revealed himself again to his disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. He revealed himself in this way. Together were Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, Zebedee's two sons, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing. They said to him, we will also come with you. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. When it was already dawn, Jesus was standing on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, have you caught anything to eat?" They answered him, "No." So he said to them, "Cast the net over the right side of the boat, and you will find something." So they cast it, and were not able to pull it in, because of the number of fish. So the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he tucked in his garment, for he was lightly clad, and jumped into the sea. The other disciples came in the boat, for they were not far from shore, only about 100 yards, dragging the net with the fish. When they climbed out on shore, they saw a charcoal fire with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you just caught." So Simon Peter went over and dragged the net ashore, full of 153 large fish. Even though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come, have breakfast." And none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" because they realized it was the Lord. Jesus came over and took the bread and gave it to them, and in like manner the fish. This was now the third time Jesus was revealed to his disciples after being raised from the dead. All right. How does that sit with people? It's one of those sort of chock full of stuff gospels.
Brother?
Yes?
What's the significance of the net not being torn?
It depends who you read.
I knew that would be nice.
Yeah. It's kind of like, given the fact that with John, there's like symbol upon symbol upon symbol upon symbol, I think it was St. Jerome back in the 5th century, the 400s, who gave the idea that the unbroken net, which is very similar to the unbroken net in Luke chapter 5, where at the beginning of Luke's gospel, there's a similar catch of fish. They've been at it all night, they've caught nothing, and Jesus comes along and says, "Hey, throw your nets over to the side," and they catch fish, and Peter kneels down, "Leave me, Lord, I'm a sinful man." There's a very similar storyline. But I think according to St. Jerome, the net symbolizes the church. That even with a great haul of fish, specifically numbered 153, which I think also St. Jerome gives the idea that at his time, there were 153 known fish to people. And they weren't cataloged the way we have them cataloged now with genus and species, but you probably had some idea of, this is a carp versus this is a flounder versus this is a crayfish or whatever. But 153 known species at the time of Jesus, and then the unbroken net would be symbolic of the church not being torn. Which, again, that's a symbol. Must have been one heck of a net to catch that many fish and not be torn. Because they were nets, they were drag nets. You throw this huge net into the water, and you would sort of scoon around with the boat, and you hope the net would pick up a school of fish. You drag the net into the boat, and then drag the net and the boat to the shore, dump the fish on the shore, and then sort out the fish you could eat and the fish you couldn't eat, and go from there. They were not fishing with rods and reels. They were fishing with nets, very fine mesh nets, to catch the fish in the Sea of Tiberias. Does that answer the question? Again, we don't know what John specifically had in mind. The commentaries think that's a very good explanation, that it symbolizes something more than just a net, and the amount of fish symbolizes something more than just literally 153 flopping fish on the shore, that this is symbolic of the fullness of humanity, and this is the unbreakability of the church. makes sense. Sure. Anyone else have a question? Okay. Yes.
How many times, I don't know, it seems to me every time Jesus, after he rose from the dead and meets with people, he shares the bread with them. How many times was that?
I mean, numerically, how many times?
Yeah.
Well, let's see. There's this time here in John with the bread and the fish on the charcoal fire. There's the scene last week where he eats the fish. They give him the fish in the upper room. There's a time in Emmaus where he breaks the bread in the inn or the house in Emmaus, and the disciples recognize who he is. So at least 3 times. I'm sure there are other times. And of course, every time you hear the word breaking bread, or the phrase breaking bread, your mind should automatically go to the Mass, automatically go to the Eucharist, automatically go to John 6, the discourse on the bread of life. All those things should come flooding back to your minds automatically. To the early church, who was experiencing these things for the first time, it was almost a code. You didn't share these things externally to the church because you were an underground church. There were no churches like this in Palestine. There are now. But then there weren't. You met and had Eucharist in people's houses. And you knew that that was a church house because very often there was a symbol on the wall or the door that said, this is a Christian house. Could have been the fish symbol, could have been a cross, could have been anything else. Could have been a rooster, could have been a peacock. Depends on what culture you were in. There was some kind of reference point to let you know as a fellow Christian that if you came here at dawn on Sunday, there would be Eucharist. Now we have signs and billboards and bulletins and things like that, but we're 2,000 years plus after the fact. So the phrase breaking of bread meant for them the whole Mass, the liturgy of the Word, the reading of the prophets and Moses and the law, and then you'd have the presider, the father, the priest, an apostle perhaps will give a talk, a homily, a sermon. Then they would take up a collection for the poor, and then they bring up the bread and the wine, and they would have the Last Supper institution. And then everyone would partake of the bread and the cup. You'd have some more prayers and praise and singing, and then people would go about the rest of their day. Usually in the wee hours of the morning on Sunday. Back then, Sunday was a work day. The Sabbath for the Jews was still Saturday. And if you were a Jewish Christian, you probably kept that for a while until the split between the two was really a split. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. I love this line. It happens twice. Jesus revealed himself. There's that reflexive again. To his disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. Guess where we are not this time? We're not in Jerusalem. We're not near Jerusalem. We're not even in Judea. We're up in Galilee again, where all things started. So they're back home in Capernaum or nearabouts along the sea. Together were Simon Peter. That's John's preferred term for the apostle Peter, Simon Peter. Thomas, called Didymus, or twin. Nathanael from Cana in Galilee. Zebedee's 2 sons, you know who those are, John and James, the brothers, and 2 others. So we have 7 people. We know all about Simon Peter and his declaration of who Jesus is. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. That encounter he has with Jesus at Caesarea Philippi. Nathanael also has an encounter with Jesus in the early part of John's Gospel, where Jesus proclaims to Nathanael that he saw him sitting under a fig tree, calls him a righteous Jew, a good son of Israel, a man without guile. And Nathanael's response is, wow, Master, you are the Son of God and the King of Israel. Peter had said, you are the Christ. You are the Messiah. the Son of the living God. And our friend Thomas, the twin, in next week's Gospel from John, my Lord and my God. We have three positive affirmations, exclamations of these three men at different points in the Gospels, revealing to Jesus who Jesus is by their own experience. They have come to know and to believe that Jesus is Messiah, he's Christ, he's Son of the living God, he's the King of Israel, the descendant of King David. He's all these titles, but they're saying it for the first time. We say those things all the time now because it's part of our worship, part of our liturgy. These men were saying it with, oh my God, that kind of really visceral kind of emotional experience. Imagine Thomas putting his hand in the side of Christ and going, okay, I get it. I believe now. Of course, Jesus chides him and says, what about those who don't see me and still believe? So these three apostles are named specifically in this gospel by John for a purpose, for a reason, to remind us of who Jesus is. Okay. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. Both Peter, all three of them, Peter, Nathaniel, and Thomas, don't come to those moments, though, without a little bit of human, how do we call this, frailty getting in the way. Peter, as you're all aware, loves to be impetuous. Oh, Lord, I'll die with you. A couple hours later, Jesus who? He goes from defending Jesus to denying Jesus. At one point, he rebukes Jesus, and Jesus rebukes him back. Philip finds Nathanael sitting under the fig tree, tells him about Jesus, who he just met. We just met this guy. He's the Messiah that Moses wrote about. Nathanael says, oh yeah? What good can come from Nazareth? And of course, Thomas, I won't believe until I touch him. So all three of these men, despite the fact that they give these affirmations of divinity to Christ, they don't do it immediately. There's a process going on where they, in their own minds, in their own souls, wrestle with, come to grips with who Jesus is. And even Nathanael, that mocking tone, what good can come from Nazareth? He learns very quickly what good can come from Nazareth. Okay. Simon Peter, I am going fishing. It's as if the resurrection hasn't taken place. I'm going back home. I'm going to kiss my wife. I'm going fishing. I need some breakfast. Let's go, guys. And they go. We will come with you. We will join you. So we have the 6 other apostles with Peter. But that night they catch nothing. Surprise. Did they really catch nothing? Or is John being symbolic again? Maybe a little bit of both. Maybe it wasn't the night for fishing. But when it was already dawn, so the darkness is fading, the light is coming up over the horizon, Jesus is standing on the shore. He's not sitting by the fire, poking it. He's not playing with the water. He's not writing in the sand like he did with the woman caught in adultery. He's standing on the shore. That's significant. In the Acts of the Apostles, when Stephen the deacon is being stoned to death, he sees heaven open, and he sees Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Not seated on the throne, but standing. Jesus' work is not done. He's not resting on his laurels. He's waiting to elicit more response in faith from these men, especially from Peter, as we'll see. So Jesus was standing on the shore, but again, the disciples do not recognize him, do not realize who it is. Jesus said to them, "Children, children, have you caught anything to eat?" They answered him, "No." So he said to them, "Cast your net over the right side of the boat, and you will find something." So they cast it, and were not able to pull it in because of the number of fish. So the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." Remember a few weeks ago, we had John and Peter running to the tomb, and John is the younger of the two apostles. He gets there first, but doesn't go in, sort of puts his head in the door or in the side of the cave, but doesn't enter. Peter comes up, boom, barrels right into the cave, right into the tomb. Here, the two same apostles, Peter and John, are on the same boat, same fishing trip, same lack of success. They catch the fish. John has a revelation in his own mind. Oh, it's Jesus. So he tells Peter, the same way that Peter asked John to ask Jesus who the betrayer was at the Last Supper. There's this relationship between John and Peter, which is preserved, especially in John's Gospel. So John says those immortal words, "It is the Lord." What does Peter do? Well, Peter tucks in his garment, for he was lightly clad, and jumped into the sea. Now, I don't know about you people, but if I'm going to jump into the sea, I'll take my clothes more off than on. But it's Peter. Again, did he physically jump into the sea? I'm sure he did. That's just Peter being Peter. But if he's stripped for work and wearing just a loincloth, and maybe what we call now like a t-shirt, and I think in Greek it's called a chiton, it's sort of a shirt that goes no sleeves, from the neck down to the middle of the thigh. He may have had that garment on and perhaps a loincloth beneath that and had like a larger robe that he tucked in as he jumped into the sea. He's so excited to see Jesus, now that he knows who it is, he jumps into the water. They're not that far from shore, only 300 yards. But yet he jumps in. He walks to the shore, or swims to the shore, partly swims, partly walks, gets to the shore, and there is the risen Christ. Now, to add another layer, in the Greek New Testament of this passage, which I looked up the other day, the word for garment here, or outer garment, is two words in English, it's one word in the Greek. It is the same phrase, the same wording that John uses at the foot washing scene earlier in his gospel. They're at the Last Supper table. John records that Jesus gets up from the table, removes his outer garment, lays it aside, pours water into a basin, and begins to wash the apostles' feet. And what happens when he gets to Peter? Peter wants nothing to do with it. Peter does not want a bath at this point. But yet later on, when John says it's the Lord, Peter wants the full immersion bath. He wants to jump into the sea and get to Jesus as soon as possible. There's been a shift in Peter's mentality. At the Last Supper, Jesus was kneeling in front of him, washing his dirty, grubby feet. Something only a slave would do. Not the rabbi, not the master of the house, let alone the master of the universe. Peter would have nothing to do with it. But then Jesus says, if I don't wash you, that's the end of us. You'll have no part of my inheritance. So Peter gives in. But there was a struggle. There was a fight of wills between Jesus and Peter. But now he has experienced the taste of the risen Lord, and he wants more. Once he realizes who's on the shore, not only does he jump in, he gets dressed. It's a formal occasion. He wants to be with Jesus. Does that make sense? Okay. So, the other disciples came in the boat, the other 6 guys, for they were not far from shore, only about 100 yards, so 300 feet, dragging the net with the fish. When they climbed out on the shore, they saw a charcoal fire with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you just caught." So Simon Peter went over and dragged the net ashore full of 153 large fish. Even though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Do you guys remember the scene in the courtyard of the high priest where it was a cool spring evening and the guards and servants were gathered around a charcoal fire to keep warm? And our friend Simon Peter was also there warming himself in the cool of the evening, and he gets confronted by people who are half his size physically, the girl at the gate. And he denies even knowing who Jesus is. John is setting up the next part of the gospel where Peter and Jesus had this mano a mano on the shore without the other 6 there. The charcoal fire is a key reminder to the early church and to us, if we read the scriptures closely, that this scene is meant to rehabilitate Peter's character. 3 times denied, 3 times affirmed in love, 3 times, "I do not know who you are." He swears, he curses, he cries bitterly. Peter gets hurt when Jesus asks him the 3rd time, "Lord, you know I love you." So these are all symbols that John uses to remind us of our human nature, indicated by the supreme foible of Peter, and also by the supreme forgiveness of the risen Christ, who forgave it and turned it around. Does that make sense? Okay.
Brother,
Yes?
there's significance to the charcoal fire. And in my head, I'm thinking, it's a wood fire. You know, did they make charcoal?
I think if they had charcoal at that point, they knew how to burn wood to the point of making it charcoal. Yeah, I mean, this is 2,000 years ago. They had coal to burn incense. So they would know how to make charcoal. Yeah. They had no oil lamps. They didn't have candles, the wax. They may have had tallow, the fat of animals, that was made harder with other substances and put like a wick through them. So we have all the stuff manufactured today. Back then, it was homemade. And a charcoal fire is probably easier to make than getting some wood on the shore. It's all sand and rocks. So, but where did Jesus get the charcoal? Do you go to the local Ace Hardware and buy a bag of, Kingsford? We don't know those details. It just says there was a charcoal fire there with fish on it and some bread. And he says, "Bring over some more fish. We're having breakfast, guys." So, yeah, charcoal fire there and a charcoal fire in the courtyard of Caiaphas in Jerusalem. Yeah. It's one of those things, it's there. It's a detail that we don't miss, but it's symbolic of, it should remind us of Peter in both places. Peter denying in the courtyard of Caiaphas, and Peter being rehabilitated in John 21. So Jesus said, "Come, have breakfast." We mentioned the bread, the fish. Jesus and fish and bread. He multiplies the loaves and fishes in all the Gospels. all four of the Gospels. It's one of those rare occasions where Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have the multiplication of the loaves and the fishes. It's that important of a scenario because it indicates the reality of Eucharist. And then the baskets of food left over. In one gospel, it's 7 hampers full. In another gospel, it's 12 hampers full. 7, of course, is the fullness. They had the 7 days of creation, or the 6 days of creation, and the Sabbath day of rest. 12 baskets left over, the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles. So all this symbolism is just oozing everywhere with irony, you know. How many baskets did you pick up? Oh, 7. How many baskets did you pick up? Oh, 12. It's not accidental. It means something. It means something quite profound, as it does here with the fish and the loaves on the shore. None of the others asked, "Who are you?" Can you imagine had they asked him, "Oh, by the way, sir, who are you?" What his response would have been. Thomas asked during the Last Supper. Philip asks questions during the Last Supper. Jude, the apostle, asks questions. And he gives them these theologically ostentatious answers for the most part. He tells Thomas, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," those kinds of things. Had they asked him who he was here, I'm not quite sure what he would have said. My guess is he probably would have said something, "Don't you guys get it yet? This is the 3rd time I've appeared to you after being raised from the dead. Don't you guys get it? Here, look, fish, bread, water, more fish that wasn't there before. I am who I am. I am Jesus. You know me. I know you." No one asked him who he was, because they realized it was the Lord. Jesus came over and took the bread and he gave it to them. Again, that liturgical gesture, that Eucharistic gesture, taking the bread, blessing it, breaking it, distributing it. And in like manner, the fish. This was now the 3rd time Jesus was revealed to his disciples after being raised from the dead. Everyone okay? Any questions? So that's the gospel for the week, the Friday after Easter. This one is the gospel for the Saturday after Easter. It's from the 16th chapter of St. Mark's Gospel. Short-fingered Mark, shortest of the Gospels. Chapter 16, verses 9 to 15. When Jesus had risen early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven out 7 demons. She went and told his companions, who were mourning and weeping. When they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe. After this, he appeared in another form to 2 of them walking along on their way to the country. They returned and told the others, but they did not believe them either. But later, as the 11 were at table, he appeared to them and rebuked them for their unbelief and their hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had been raised. He said to them, "Go into the whole world and proclaim the gospel to every creature." That is Mark's summary, in a sense, of the apparitions that he's heard about. Now, this is before Matthew and Luke and John have put pen to paper and written their Gospels. So the stories about Mary Magdalene at the tomb, the stories about the 2 disciples to and from Emmaus, Mark knows about them. He knows they returned to the upper room that same night. He knows that the risen Christ appears to them and the others in the upper room. But no one is believed. Mary Magdalene is considered to be crazy, hysterical, untrustworthy. The two disciples who've come and gone from Emmaus are not believed. No one believes. Jesus appears to them, and he gets on them for not believing. Surprise. Rebuked them. Rebuked we don't usually use that word too often these days. It's a very stern word. It means to really reprimand harshly, like a parent to a naughty child. He's really telling them, wake up, guys. It's me. Believe. Their unbelief and their hardness of heart. Hardness of heart. Last week we mentioned the obstinacy of Pharaoh's heart in Exodus in not releasing the children of Israel from bondage. Here he's accusing the apostles and disciples of being equally obstinate of heart, of their hardness of heart in not believing the people he sent to them who have seen him. What more do you guys want? So he has to appear to them himself so they get the message and get it correctly. And then he says, the Great Commission, go out into the whole world and proclaim the gospel to every creature. Not every human being, every creature. This is a Jewish writing. All creation collapsed with the sin of Adam and Eve. All creation is redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. Not just human beings. All of creation. Does that make sense? No? Okay. Back to the garden, the original garden of paradise, of Eden. We have Adam and Eve, the pinnacle of creation. They're perfect. They're flawless. They haven't sinned. They are made in the image and the likeness of God. The angels even are, in some sense, jealous. That's why 1/3 of them rebel. In their perfection, they were so much like God that God would walk in the garden with them, friend to friend. And God would go around, hey, Adam, where are you? And Adam would come running out, and they'd have breakfast or whatever. In the cool of the evening, it says in Genesis, God would appear in the garden and have conversations with Adam and Eve, like we're having right now. Open, horizontal, friendly. When Adam and Eve, through the wiles of the devil, decided to basically tell God to pound sand, essentially, by disobedience, not only did that sin affect them personally as individuals and affect us as their descendants of the human race, it also affected the rest of creation. God condemns the serpent. God condemns Adam. God condemns Eve. Not just the two people. The earth is in rebellion. The earth will bring forth fruit, but you have to work for it now. You didn't have to work for it before. It gave its fruits to you willingly. Now that you have sinned, the earth is going to hold back. You have to work by the sweat of your face to get the bread you eat. Eve, because you disobeyed, you will bring forth children in pain. That was not the case before. Childbirth pains was not naturally decided. It was unnaturally decided after the fall. So the entire universe is ruptured because we're made in the image and likeness of God. And when creatures rebel against the Creator, everything goes with it. When they go south, the universe goes south. Does that make sense? So basically, all relationships are ruptured. The relationship between man and his inner self, man and his soul, his spiritual essence, that gets wounded. Man's relationship with his fellow man is ruptured, is wounded. Man's relationship with the divine, with God, is ruptured, is wounded. Man's relationship with the universe, with the cosmos, also ruptured and wounded. Because we can't fix it ourselves, God decides to fix it himself by becoming human, by full, complete, and total immersion in the human condition. Remember in the Passion narratives, when Jesus is dying on the cross, and actually does die, and there's a solar eclipse and an earthquake in Matthew's Gospel? You can't have a solar eclipse when there's a full moon. There was a full Passover moon because it was Passover. There has to be a full moon for Passover, otherwise it's not Passover. But for symbolic purposes, or maybe not, maybe miraculous purposes, because God can do what he wants with the laws of nature, creation is in mourning for its Lord. A few people are too who know who Jesus is, and a few who don't know him personally but realize who he is, like the centurion. Truly this is the Son of God, or this was an innocent man, depending on which text you read. Humanity grieves, the earth grieves, Mother Nature grieves, because they know who he is. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? It wasn't just Adam and Eve. And if you look in today's paper or read the online news, it gets more and more obvious that sinfulness is not too far away from anybody. Anyone have any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned the spread of the gospel.
Yes.
What was their understanding of the gospel at that time? They didn't have the Bible. Right?
They didn't have the Bible like we have it now. They had the Old Testament books, obviously, and they were good Jews. They knew their texts. The gospel was basically Jesus is the Son of God. He died and was raised from the dead, and he's living forever, and he wants you to be part of his kingdom. If you receive baptism, that's how you do it. It's very simple. There's no real heavy-duty theology. There's no mystical magic wand. It's just believe in the gospel. I mean, gospel is a contraction of God's spell. Ever heard of the play God's Spell? Well, that's the English word for good news. God's spell and becomes gospel. In the Greek is evangelion. We get the word evangelist from there. And names like evangelista, evangeline, vangelos in Greek, which is short for evangelos. This good news of the death and resurrection of Jesus was the core is that this guy is God. He became flesh for our sake. He died and was raised. He is now Lord of creation. You can believe in him if you pronounce his name with faith and receive baptism. Period. Very simple. Yes?
Also, the people that couldn't just accept that simply and wanted something more than that, Jesus had opened the
Yes.
And explained all through where he is.
Yes.
Indicated in those scriptures.
Yes.
So somebody who required more details and who thinks differently, they would have been able to give their information.
Yeah.
Even without our written New Testament, they have a huge amount of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And Jesus opening your minds and hearts
To understand the scriptures.
to share with them.
Beginning where we were last week with Moses and the rest of the prophets. There's a wonderful passage, we read it a few weeks ago, about the Ethiopian eunuch in the Acts of the Apostles. He is in his chariot going back from Jerusalem to Ethiopia. So he's the treasurer for the queen of the Ethiopians. So the guy has some means. He has a chariot with horses and a driver, okay? So he's no slouch in terms of money. Apparently he's heard of Judaism. He may have became a Jew, which would be very unusual, being from Africa and also being a eunuch. But at any rate, he's there. He's in his chariot returning from Jerusalem after receiving, or going to the pilgrimage feast of Pentecost, and perhaps even Passover. Going to go back and forth for 50 days. It's a long trip, so maybe he's there for Passover and for Pentecost. He's in his chariot reading from the book of the prophet Isaiah. He's reading about the suffering servant, about this man who is being tortured and executed for no apparent reason, who is not defending himself, who is not opening his mouth as a lamb before the shearers, as the text actually says. Philip, the deacon, is told by the Holy Spirit to catch up with that chariot. He overhears the man reading the Old Testament, and he's still running, apparently, next to the chariot. And he gets the guy's attention and says, "Do you know what you're reading?" He says, "Well, how do I know what I'm reading if someone doesn't explain it to me?" So they stop the chariot. Philip gets into the chariot, sits down next to the Ethiopian, and explains to him about Jesus based on that prophecy from Isaiah. How long were they on the chariot? We don't know. Luke doesn't tell us that in the Acts of the Apostles. Apparently they were long enough that the man was converted, and when they saw water, he asked to be baptized. They get out of the chariot, go down into the water. Philip baptizes him. The Holy Spirit snatches him away to someplace else in Palestine, and the Ethiopian gets back in his chariot, and he's happy as a lark. He has received Jesus in his heart. He's been baptized, and he goes back to his kingdom and lives the rest of his life. He may have preached there. We don't know. But he doesn't receive confirmation. He doesn't receive Holy Communion. He just gets baptized. And all because he's told that Jesus is Lord, who suffered and died and rose. Period. More or less. I mean, Philip may have told him a lot more than that. But he didn't get 500 pages of Thomas Aquinas. Obviously. So, yeah, I mean, back then, it was very, very simple. Very basic. Jesus is Lord. Well, how'd that happen? Well, then you expand on it. And then you get into theology of the pre-existent Jesus with the Father and the Spirit before creation. And you get into the incarnation. And you get into the role of the Blessed Virgin Mary, how she participated in the incarnation. And you get the infancy narratives with Joseph and the star and the Magi. All that stuff develops decades after the apostles go out and preach the original message. It develops organically over time. It's there in a nutshell, yes, but it develops, takes on layers and symbols and symbols and layers. But at the very beginning, it was very simple. Yes, Liz?
Okay, so in the early church, many people were baptized, but when it came to like Holy Eucharist, even confirmation, that probably came years later, right?
Not at once. Well, it depends. There are scenes in the Acts of the Apostles where people are baptized and the Holy Spirit comes on them immediately.
Okay.
That's one of the things that when Peter is in the house of Cornelius and Peter is preaching the word to them, which is very basic, Jesus is Lord. And this is how I know he's Lord. And as he's speaking, the Holy Spirit just pops in, and they all start preaching in tongues, or praying in tongues. And then Peter has to explain to everybody else why he entered the house of a Gentile. He said, well, it wasn't my idea. It was God's idea. I just did what God told me to do. He didn't go there because he wanted free food. It was something that God was pushing Peter to do. It wasn't something Peter wanted to do.
Okay, Peter, let's say, as an example, Peter went to that house.
Yes.
But the people at that time, did they realize that it was the Holy Spirit coming to them?
They might have. Peter might have explained to them about baptism, Father, Son, and Spirit. Again, very basic.
Yeah.
Not 500 pages of Thomas on who God the Father is. Not another chapter on the incarnation of the Logos in Christ. Not another chapter on the procession of the Holy Spirit. All that theology stuff was not in their minds. What was in their minds was the reality of who the risen Jesus was and what he's doing for them, like sending the Holy Spirit wherever he feels like it. Yeah, very basic. But yet, Cornelius sees an angel. The angel tells Cornelius to send for Peter. And Peter is told to go with the men from Cornelius. So God's operating here. It's not Peter's idea. Cornelius was to go knocking on Peter's door. He sends messengers to Peter, but Peter has to be told to go with him. Does that make sense? Okay.
I listen to you say that it's that simple, and it still is.
Yeah, I mean,
Or
if you...
all the other colors and flavors and layers of understanding and symbolism, that's all wonderful stuff.
The core, the technical term is kerygma. The core of the proclamation is Jesus is Lord. Okay, how that happened, and then you go into the details. But yeah.
I would say that about Benedict. You read Benedict, and he's unbelievably brilliant. And yet it is hard. He's a very simple man who loves Jesus Christ. That's who he is.
Yeah.
That's the core, that's the basic knowledge of who he is as a man, as a priest, and a pope.
Yeah.
And it just knocks me out. It's brilliant, man.
I mean, how could it be anything else but simple? When you look at the saints in the church, and we just had 10 new saints made a few days ago by Pope Francis. And we have these men and women who are elderly in a sense. They're not children. But yet on the other extreme, you do have children. You have Jacinta and Francisco Marto from Portugal. They were not theologians. They were probably illiterate. They couldn't read Thomas Aquinas if you asked them to. Bernadette couldn't do her Hail Mary straight. She barely got it through communion class with the sisters at Lourdes. Juan Diego, though he was in his mid-50s, he was also illiterate. He was not reading Thomas Aquinas or anybody other theologians from Europe, let alone. That's how simple the faith is for these simple souls. Not simplistic, don't get me wrong. Simple in their trust, their childlikeness. That's where the simplicity is. Believing as a child believes in his mom and dad. That's the kind of faith we have to have in Jesus. You can read all the theology in the world, have all the 15 PhDs. Okay. That's nice. As long as you use those PhDs to help people get to Jesus. If you use those PhDs to augment your personality and create your own narcissistic cult, well, that's a little bit different. That's a problematic situation. But yeah, if you don't use it to bring people to Jesus, then you're not using it correctly. Because even there, God gives us the intelligence, the human intellect, the ability to get those degrees, to study. That's a gift from God. And we're obliged to return that gift, or at least share it with other people. Otherwise, God's going to be a little ticked off. Okay. Any further questions? We're over our hour, but yes.
You said about Jesus is 99 always Peter acknowledges that he's the Son of God.
Mm-hmm.
That certainly changed how people thought about Jesus, but I just read something recently. Also, it tells you something about God. God is not just God. If he's got a son, he's Father.
Yes.
That reveals a little bit more about who God is.
Yeah.
That he's Father.
Well, that's all over the part of John's Gospel. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I do the Father's will. My food is to do the Father's will. The Father and I are one. All those Johannine lines that the Gospel has, the Father and I are this, the Father and I are that. That's all prefigured, Abraham and Isaac. When Abraham is asked to sacrifice Isaac, it's a prefigurement of God the Father sacrificing his only begotten Son. The wood of the sacrifice, the ram caught in the thicket, the mountain of Moriah, which is Jerusalem, all those things are cohesive. It's not there accidentally. It all fits. It's a wonderful mosaic. It all fits. Okay. Well, shall we conclude with a prayer, as we've been doing? Let us pray. Grant, Almighty and merciful God, that we may in truth receive a share in the resurrection of Christ your Son, who lives and reigns with you in unity of the Holy Spirit, God forever and ever. Amen. May the Lord bless us, protect us from all evil, and bring us to everlasting life. Amen. Thank you all. See you next Tuesday.